The air in the underground command bunker, one of three spaced 500 meters apart for redundancy, was thick with a mixture of stale coffee, sweat, and focused tension. On the screens before the Ukrainian operators, the clock was ticking down. A power surge from their drone launch had been detected by Russian forces, a digital flare in the dark that announced their presence. Artillery shells were already beginning to scream overhead, the first ranging shots in a deadly process of bracketing. The operators knew they had, at most, 12 minutes. 12 minutes to execute a mission that had been weeks in the planning, 12 minutes before their own position would become a cratered, smoking ruin. Every second was precious, a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass that measured not just the success of their operation, but their very survival. This was the sharp edge of modern warfare, a contest fought not with massed armies, but with small, agile teams and cutting-edge technology. The men and women in these bunkers were not just soldiers. They were pilots, engineers, and strategists. Their battlefield, a digital one overlaid upon the physical terrain of southern Zaporizhia. Their fingers danced across keyboards and joysticks, coaxing their flock of 11 drones toward a singular, high-value objective. The rhythmic thud of distant Russian artillery served as a constant, unnerving metronome, a reminder that the enemy was hunting them just as relentlessly as they were hunting their target. The pressure was immense, a palpable force that could crush the unprepared, but this team was steeled by training and a grim determination. The mission's success depended on flawless coordination and a deep understanding of the enemy's capabilities. The operators communicated in low, clipped tones, a language of technical shorthand and shared experience. They were monitoring drone telemetry, enemy radio chatter, and the thermal signatures of the approaching train. Each operator was a node in a distributed network of human intelligence, their minds linked by the singular goal of landing a decisive blow against a critical artery of the Russian war machine. They were a microcosm of Ukraine's broader strategy to be smarter, faster, and more adaptable than their larger, more heavily armed adversary. In these final, frantic minutes, that philosophy was being put to the ultimate test. The shells were landing closer now, shaking the earth and causing dust to sprinkle from the bunker's reinforced ceiling. A flicker of an overhead light, a momentary glitch on a secondary screen. Each was a stark reminder of their vulnerability. But their focus remained unbroken, locked onto the video feeds streaming back from their airborne assets. The target was drawing nearer, a long dark serpent slithering along the steel rails of Corridor 7. The operators ignored the growing danger to themselves. Their entire world condensed into the pixels on their screens and the rapidly closing window of opportunity. The final 12 minutes had begun, and the fate of a 4,000-ton ammunition train hung in the balance. The target itself was a logistician's dream and a defender's nightmare. It was a 15-car Russian ammunition train, a lumbering behemoth carrying a payload of 4,000 tons of high explosives and fuel. This was not just a resupply run, it was a mobile arsenal, a critical infusion of destructive power destined for the beleaguered Russian front lines in southern Zaporizhia. Moving at a steady 45 kilometers per hour, it was a predictable, high-value target, but one that was far from undefended. Two armored escort cars bristled with defensive weaponry, their crews on high alert for the ever-present threat of Ukrainian partisan or drone activity. The train represented a massive concentration of Russian military investment and logistical importance, a single point of failure that, if broken, could cripple operations for weeks. Intelligence had pinpointed its route and schedule, a feat of modern surveillance and clandestine information gathering. For the Ukrainian planners, the train was more than just a collection of rail cars. It was a symbol of the Russian war effort's reliance on brute force logistics. Its destruction would send shockwaves far beyond the immediate blast radius, sowing chaos in supply chains and demoralizing troops awaiting its precious cargo. The decision to strike was made with a clear understanding of the risks and rewards. Intercepting such a heavily laden train was a rare opportunity to inflict disproportionate damage, to trade a handful of low-cost drones for a strategic victory that could alter the tactical landscape of the entire southern front. The planning phase was meticulous, accounting for every known Russian countermeasure in the sector. The Ukrainian command knew the train would not be traveling in a vacuum. It would be protected by a layered defense system, including mobile electronic warfare units and dedicated air defense platforms shadowing its route. The challenge was not simply to find the train, but to penetrate this protective bubble. The planners modeled various attack scenarios, wargaming the likely Russian responses to a drone swarm. They identified potential weaknesses in the train's escort and the limitations of Russian jamming technology, designing their operation to exploit those very gaps with surgical precision and technological surprise. The strategic value of the target, designated as moving along Corridor 7, could not be overstated. This railway was a primary artery for feeding the Russian war machine in the south. Its constant use made it a vital lifeline, but also a predictable vulnerability. Every ton of ammunition, every litre of fuel that reached the front lines had to travel along these exposed steel tracks. The Ukrainians understood that in a war of attrition, severing the enemy's logistics was as crucial as winning battles on the front line. This single train, loaded with enough explosives to level a small town, was the perfect target to prove their point and demonstrate the growing power and sophistication of their drone forces. The attack was not a simple, single-pronged assault. It was a carefully choreographed ballet of destruction, executed by a swarm of 11 drones launched from their hidden bunkers. The Ukrainian operators orchestrated the attack from multiple vectors simultaneously, a tactic designed to overwhelm and confuse the Russian defenders. The drones descended upon the train in a multi-altitude formation. Some screamed in at a high altitude, presenting themselves as obvious targets to draw the attention of air defense radar. Others skimmed just meters above the ground, using the terrain to mask their approach. A third group flew directly along the center line of the tracks, a head-on charge into the teeth of the train's defenses, creating a complex, three-dimensional problem that no single defensive system could hope to solve. The Russian response was immediate and violent. A BTR-82A armored personnel carrier, one of the train's escorts, opened up with its 30mm autocannon, its tracer rounds streaking through the winter sky. One of the low-flying drones was obliterated in a flash of shrapnel. A more sophisticated Pantsir S-1 air defense system, shadowing the train, also came to life. Its radar locked onto the incoming threats, and its own 30mm cannons spat out a hail of airburst shells designed to detonate in proximity to their targets. One of the high-altitude drones was shredded by this defensive screen. But for every drone that was destroyed, several more pressed on, their operators using the chaos as cover, jinking and weaving to evade the storm of steel. The Ukrainian operators were prepared for these losses. They were a calculated part of the plan. The initial wave was designed to absorb the enemy's first response, to make the defenders reveal their positions and capabilities. Some of the high-altitude drones were decoys, their flight paths deliberately programmed to trigger the Pantsir's radar and expend its ammunition. As the Russian gunners focused on the more obvious threats, the real attackers made their move. The low-altitude drones dropped even lower, their cameras showing a blur of snow-covered ground as they raced toward their targets. Others deployed smoke countermeasures, creating a temporary screen that blinded the optical sensors of the Russian escort vehicles, buying them precious seconds to close the distance. The entire engagement unfolded in less than 2 minutes, a furious and condensed burst of action. It was a testament to the skill and nerve of the Ukrainian pilots, who were flying their machines through a gauntlet of lethal fire. They were not just pointing a weapon, they were actively dueling with sophisticated air defense systems, making split-second decisions to dodge, weave, and deploy countermeasures. 4 drones were ultimately destroyed in the assault, and 2 were damaged, but the cost was deemed acceptable. The swarm had successfully breached the outer defenses. The remaining drones, a determined vanguard of steel and silicon, were now closing in on the train itself, their cameras locked onto the specific weak points they had been programmed to destroy. As the physical battle raged in the air, a second, invisible conflict was being waged in the electromagnetic spectrum. The Russian forces, anticipating a drone attack, quickly activated their electronic warfare capabilities. A Lear-3 EW vehicle, positioned near the railway, began pumping out 10 kilowatts of jamming energy, flooding the radio frequencies commonly used to control unmanned aerial vehicles. The goal was to sever the link between the Ukrainian operators and their drones, turning the attacking swarm into a collection of unguided, useless projectiles. As the attack intensified, an even more powerful Merman BN jammer was brought online, adding its 12 kilowatts to the electronic onslaught, creating a powerful bubble of radio silence. For most conventional drones, this would have been a death sentence. Their control links would have been severed, their video feeds cut to static, leaving them to fly blindly until their batteries died or they crashed. The Russian EW systems were a formidable defense, a shield of invisible energy designed to neutralize the very technology the Ukrainians relied upon. However, the operators in the Ukrainian bunkers had anticipated this move. The invisible wall of Russian jamming washed over the battlefield, and while it did manage to disrupt some of the drones, it also had an unintended consequence. It blinded the Russians' own friendly units, interfering with their communications and sensor systems at a critical moment. This is where Ukraine's key technological advantage came into play. A portion of the drones in the swarm were not reliant on radio frequencies for control. Instead, they unspooled ultra-thin fiber optic tethers as they flew. These physical cables, miles long, relayed crystal-clear, unjammable video feeds back to the operators and carried their control commands to the drones with zero latency. While the Russian EW systems were screaming into the void of the radio spectrum, these fiber optic drones flew through the storm completely untouched, like ghosts in the machine. They were immune to the electronic blizzard, their connection to their pilots as solid and dependable as a physical wire. This single innovation rendered Russia's primary electronic countermeasure almost completely useless against the most critical assets of the attack wave. The Ukrainian operators with tethered drones retained perfect control, able to guide their machines with pinpoint accuracy, while their radio-controlled counterparts either fought through the interference or were lost. The fiber optic cables were a simple, elegant solution to a complex problem, a low-tech answer to a high-tech threat. It demonstrated a core principle of Ukrainian tactical innovation, anticipating the enemy's strengths and devising clever, asymmetrical methods to bypass them entirely. The Russian jamming was a powerful shield, but the Ukrainians had brought a weapon that simply ignored it. With the Russian defenses saturated and their electronic warfare compromised, the surviving drones reached their designated targets. The attack was not a random blitz, but a sequence of precision strikes, each aimed at a specific vulnerability to achieve a cascading failure. The first drones, armed with shaped charges, did not target the main payload. Instead, they struck the heavy steel coupling connecting the locomotive to the first of the 15 freight cars. The explosive charge detonated with a sharp crack, shearing through the metal linkage. This initial strike was designed to instantly isolate the train's motive power, ensuring the valuable cargo could not be pulled to safety or moved further down the line. It was a crippling, calculated blow. Immediately following the first hit, another drone slammed into a critical brake manifold along the train's undercarriage. The resulting explosion sent a shower of sparks and metal fragments flying, rupturing the pneumatic lines that controlled the braking system for the entire convoy. With the locomotive disconnected and the brakes destroyed, the 15 cars, laden with 4,000 tons of explosives and fuel, were now an unguided, uncontrollable projectile. continuing its forward momentum at 45 kilometers per hour along the tracks. The operators had effectively disarmed the train, turning its own mass and speed against it. The stage was now set for the final, decisive strikes. The last wave of drones focused their attack on the now isolated locomotive. One drone dove beneath the massive engine, detonating its warhead against the undercarriage and targeting the auxiliary generator. The blast ripped through the machinery, disabling the engine's secondary power systems. A moment later, a final drone executed a perfect strike on a fuel reservoir located near the engine block. This was the match thrown into the powder keg. The fuel ignited instantly, engulfing the locomotive in a roiling ball of fire. The initial explosion, though powerful, was merely the prelude to the cataclysm that was about to unfold down the line. The precision of the sequence was, honestly, just breathtaking. In a matter of seconds, the Ukrainian operators had used a handful of small, guided munitions to methodically dismantle a massive, moving target. They had severed its head, broken its legs, and set its heart on fire. Each strike was a testament to the real-time intelligence being fed back to the operators and their ability to execute a complex plan under extreme pressure. The train, which moments before had been a formidable instrument of war, was now a fractured, burning and uncontrollable wreck, sliding towards its own fiery demise. The moment of impact was over, but the chain reaction had just begun. The fire on the locomotive was the catalyst. As the now unguided freight cars continued to slide forward, they began to jackknife and derail, piling into one another with the screech of tortured metal. The immense kinetic energy of 4,000 tons of mass moving at speed was transformed into a chaotic pile-up of twisted steel. But the real destruction came from the cargo itself. The heat from the burning locomotive and the friction of the crash ignited the ammunition and fuel carried in the first few cars. What followed was not a single explosion, but a series of titanic detonations that ripped through the convoy car by car. A violent, percussive chain reaction of unimaginable force. The secondary explosions were colossal. Observers miles away saw the night sky flash white, followed by a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke that billowed thousands of feet into the air. The force of the blasts was equivalent to the detonation of 400 kilograms of TNT, a shockwave that flattened trees and shook buildings in nearby settlements. The thermal signature of the inferno spiked past 1,400 degrees Celsius, a temperature hot enough to melt steel. The very rails the train had been running on were warped and fused, and the intense heat melted the underlying steel rail ballast for an astonishing 7 kilometers along the track, turning a critical supply corridor into a molten, impassable scar. The aftermath was a scene of total devastation. The 15-car train was fractured in 3 separate places, its cars thrown from the tracks like discarded toys. The entire convoy was a smoldering, burning wreck consumed by fires that would rage for days. The air for miles around was thick with the acrid smell of burnt chemicals and explosives. This was not merely damage, it was annihilation. The rolling stock, the 4,000 tons of ammunition and the locomotive were all utterly destroyed. The strategic supply route known as Corridor 7 was no longer just blocked. It had been fundamentally erased from the map, reclassified by military planners as unserviceable, indefinite. For the Russian forces on the southern front, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. A vast quantity of desperately needed material had vanished in a flash of light. The logistical pipeline that fed their operations was severed at a critical point, forcing costly and time-consuming reroutes. The psychological effect on troops who witnessed or heard about the strike was profound, a terrifying demonstration of Ukraine's ability to reach out and touch them far behind the front lines. The chain reaction of ruin that began with a single drone strike had sent ripples of disruption and fear throughout the entire Russian military apparatus in the region. Perhaps the most staggering aspect of the entire operation was the stark contrast between the cost of the attack and the value of the damage inflicted. The Ukrainian mission, from the drones themselves to the personnel and support systems, was carried out for an estimated total cost of just $5,340. This figure accounts for the 11 drones launched, including the 4 that were destroyed and the 2 that were damaged. Each drone was a relatively inexpensive, almost disposable asset, built from commercially available components and customized for its deadly purpose. In the grand scheme of military budgets, the expenditure was little more than a rounding error, a trivial sum for a single tactical operation. On the other side of the ledger was the catastrophic financial loss suffered by Russia. The destroyed train, including the locomotive, and 15 specialized freight cars, represented a significant investment in heavy rolling stock. The cargo itself, 4,000 tons of advanced munitions, explosives and fuel, was immensely valuable. Conservative estimates place the direct financial damage at between $120 million and $128 million. For the price of a used family car, the Ukrainian forces had managed to erase an asset worth more than 20,000 times that amount. It was an almost unbelievable return on investment, a perfect example of asymmetric warfare in action. This economic disparity highlights a fundamental shift in the calculus of modern conflict. Historically, inflicting massive damage required a massive investment in force. Bomber fleets, naval strike groups, or armored divisions. The ability to project power was directly tied to economic might. This strike, however, demonstrated that small, inexpensive, and technologically advanced systems can now threaten and destroy assets that are orders of magnitude more expensive. The Ukrainians did not need to build their own multi-million-dollar train or field a complex air force to counter this threat. They needed only to be clever, precise, and willing to leverage new technology. The strategic impact amplified this cost asymmetry even further. The $125 million figure does not account for the secondary and tertiary costs of the strike. It doesn't include the price of repairing 7 kilometers of melted railway, the logistical chaos caused by the severing of Corridor 7, or the intangible but significant blow to Russian morale and operational readiness. When these factors are considered, the true cost inflicted by the $5,340 operation becomes almost immeasurable. It proves that in the 21st century battlefield, financial might alone is no guarantee of security, and that a determined adversary with the right tools can impose crippling costs with minimal expenditure. The destruction of the Russian ammunition train in southern Zaporizhzhia is more than just a single successful military operation. It is a defining vignette of modern warfare, a clear signal that the old paradigms of military strength are being rapidly overturned. The engagement showcased how a combination of precision, intelligent tactics, and technological innovation can serve as a powerful force multiplier, allowing a smaller, outgunned force to punch far above its weight. The Ukrainian operators did not rely on overwhelming numbers or brute force. Instead, they relied on superior strategy and the clever application of technology like fiber optic tethers to outwit and neutralize a conventionally powerful opponent. This event forces us to reconsider what constitutes strength in a contemporary conflict. For centuries, military power was measured in the number of soldiers, tanks, ships, and planes a nation could field. The army with the bigger battalions and heavier artillery held the decisive advantage. Today, that logic is being challenged. This strike was a victory for agility over mass, for precision over saturation. The ability to process real-time intelligence, identify a critical vulnerability, and deliver a precise effect with minimal resources has become a strategic advantage at least as important as the number of divisions in an army group. The future of warfare may belong not to the biggest, but to the smartest. The implications are profound, extending far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. The vulnerability of large, expensive, and predictable systems like trains, ships, and logistical hubs to low-cost, intelligent drone swarms is a lesson that military planners worldwide are studying with intense interest. The balance of power between offense and defense is shifting, Expensive, centralized platforms are becoming liabilities, while decentralized, networked, and inexpensive systems are proving to be lethally effective. This evolution is happening at a breathtaking pace, with both sides in the conflict rapidly developing and deploying new technologies and tactics in a deadly cycle of innovation. As we stand on the precipice of this new era, the story of this one train strike on the final day of 2025 leaves us with a critical, thought-provoking question. In an age where a $5,000 operation can inflict over $100 million in damage and grind a strategic supply line to a halt, is size still the most important factor in determining the victor, or has the nature of conflict fundamentally changed, ushering in an age where the side that can think faster, adapt quicker, and innovate more cleverly will ultimately hold the keys to victory, regardless of how large their army may be? The smoking, melted rails of Corridor 7 suggest a clear and unsettling answer.